Hey, friends. In this Death with Dignity episode, hospice nurse Penny Hawk joins us. Penny has been comforting and supporting people during their end of life experience for many years. She also has a substantial social media following on the TikTok and Instagram platforms, known as @Hospice Nurse Penny. Penny uses these platforms to educate people about hospice services, advanced directives and wills, and also death anxiety and how it impacts our lives. We encourage you to follow Penny to learn more from her TikTok or Instagram @Hospice Nurse Penny. And we thank her for her advocacy and enlightenment on the subject of death, dying, and living. Beautiful. Excellent. Well, I'm here with Nurse Penny. Is that right, Nurse Penny? That it seems like that's kind of how you're recognized, especially in the social media realm.
Yeah, my username is Hospice Nurse Penny, but people usually just call me Nurse Penny.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, it's wonderful to have you, Nurse Penny. Thank you so much for taking the time to join the Death with Dignity podcast, and really excited to talk to you and hear about your experiences as a person and as a hospice nurse, and also for you to share with our listeners about your platform on social media. You have such a unique, I guess, following in a sense, and so it's exciting to be able to get some of this information out there. But tell us a little bit about yourself, if you don't mind. We always like to start by giving our guests a chance to share anything, maybe family stuff, if you'd like, or personal stuff. Or we can just jump right into, whatever you want to get into. Maybe tell us where you're from and, go from there.
All right. So, my name is Penny. I live in Washington State, and I'm a certified hospice and palliative care nurse. I've been a hospice nurse for over 17 years now. I've worked in a variety of different settings within hospice. I've worked in an inpatient care center, a couple of them. I've done home hospice case management, and most recently, I'm a hospice quality manager. So I do a lot of regulatory and policy writing, education to other nurses, just kind of a variety of things in administration for hospice. Um, I live in a cabin in the mountains off the grid with my husband and my cat Pam.
Nice.
We just moved here last September. Yeah. So my current role now, I'm able to work virtually. So that's kind of nice. I'm able to work from home.
Wow, that is so neat. You've had a lot of experience in the hospice field. Which one of those experiences do you think you gravitate towards most, or maybe is there one that you enjoyed more than the others, or that really kind of sticks out to you?
Yeah, I really loved inpatient hospice. That was really where my heart was. I always say that was, at the bedside, in your face, death and dying. You're really dealing with dying patients every day. And I really loved doing that, but my circumstances changed and I was recruited by another agency to do home hospice. And I liked that as well. Not as much as doing the inpatient care center, but I ended up in quality because I was working in the greater Seattle area. I was commuting a lot. It was starting to take its toll on my body being in my car for so long. And I just wanted to kind of step away from the bedside for a bit and to learn more about the other side of hospice. I have always been the kind of person that I want to know everything there is to know about whatever it is I'm doing, whatever it is. If I'm a bartender, which I have been, if I'm a vet tech, which I have been, I always want to learn every possible aspect of that position that I can. And I think it really also lends to me being able to educate about hospice on social media, to know all of the different conditions of participation, the rules and regulations, to be able to help people understand that side of it, as well as the actual dying process.
Wow, that's impressive. Before we really continue, give us a little bit, I guess, of an overview as to what hospice care entails, especially for maybe some of our listeners who might not know exactly what that means. I think probably we're pretty educated at this point, but I think you're our first official hospice nurse that we've interviewed. So that's another reason why we're really happy to have you on. But tell us about what it means to provide hospice care.
Well, first of all, even to be qualified to be on hospice, a person has to have a terminal diagnosis with a life expectancy of 6 months or less, to be able to be on hospice. And hospice is really focused on quality of life over quantity of life. So people who come on hospice are no longer seeking treatment, or there isn't any treatment available for their disease. And we're really just trying to help them to be comfortable, to remain in their home or wherever they call their home. The majority of hospice care is done in a person's home, be that a house, a nursing home, or van down by the river. Wherever a person lives is where we're providing hospice. And then we do have hospice care centers. Those are usually for people who are needing skilled nursing interventions, 24/7 care, not what we would call custodial care, which would be like a nursing home where you have aides that will clean them up, but actual need for skilled nursing. So patients who usually have cancer, who have symptoms that cannot be managed in the home. So agitation, pain, shortness of breath, and we're usually doing infusions, or other kind of aggressive treatment for symptom management. So that's kind of the difference between inpatient hospice and home hospice. But the majority of home hospice is done really where the person lives.
Excellent answer. And so many questions just from hearing you talk. And yeah, so impressive. When considering hospice and the idea that you're constantly dealing with people who are at the end of their rope, at the end of the line, really, I would think at times that could be pretty emotionally draining. And I wonder, how do you find the balance of, maintaining positivity in life and then also being surrounded by people who are dying, basically?
Well, you definitely have to be cut out for it. And there are times when it can be emotionally stressful, but you have to be able to have good boundaries. One of the things I always tell people who are going into hospice nursing is you really have to know, when to leave your work at work, and to recognize that this is a job. You're going there to take care of this person's needs and their family. And the expectation is they're going to die. We know that going into it. And as long as we've done a good job with managing their symptoms, making them as comfortable as possible, educating the family so they know what to expect, so they can take care of their person, so that they're not afraid of whatever they're seeing with their person. When the person dies, if we've done all that, it's a job well done. So I always say, I would not want to be a pediatric nurse. I don't want to work with kids in hospice or out of hospice. Any kind of pediatric nursing would not be for me, but there are nurses who are cut out for it. It's the same with hospice. You either able to do it, and you kind of are able to kind of have those emotional boundaries, or you're not able to do it. And then you have to, move into a different field of nursing.
Yes, and we're certainly thankful for people like you who are willing to support, the those receiving hospice services. And I think it's evident just by chatting with you so far that this is it seems like you're passionate about it, and that's so important to, I think, probably provide those positive services to your patients. Will you tell us a little bit about the family aspect? I can imagine possibly you probably have the opportunity to be involved with this person and their families as well if they have family remaining. So can you tell us about what that process might look like and how you may support the family as well as you move forward?
Yeah, the family is a really important part of hospice care because they are usually the ones who are taking care of their person who's dying. We don't do 24/7 care. That's kind of a myth about hospice. People expect that hospice nurses go in and do 24-hour care, and we don't. We do skilled nursing, but our main part of our role is to educate the family on how to take care of their person. So we do get very involved with them. They're an integral part of the plan of care. They're included in the plan of care. We often become closer with the family than we do with the patient, because there comes a point when a patient is dying where they are no longer responsive, and we're still going and seeing the person, but we're really interacting more with the family. So that relationship goes on longer than the relationship we have with the person. And then after the person dies, we have grief support services. So we have another whole different department that takes care of the grief factor for the family. And that's actually a Medicare requirement. We have to do that. All Medicare certified hospice agencies have to provide, offer up to a year worth of grief support services. So, and that's not only important for the family, but it's also important for the person who's dying to know. I've had several patients in the past who were concerned about what was going to happen to their family after they died. And when I said, actually, we are going to look after them for you, we're going to provide grief support services for you, it brought them a lot of relief to know that, because many times when a person is dying, that's one of their major concerns. People usually get to a point where they're accepting of their own death, but they're more concerned about what's going to happen to those who they are leaving behind. So it's really good for them to know that the hospice care is not just for the person, it's for the family.
Yeah, beautifully said, and some really important information there for people who are listening and ever in the position to reminder that there are support services available for you and your family as well. Thank you for sharing that, Nurse Penny. I wanted to ask, you mentioned having a couple different jobs or maybe kind of careers along the way. How did you find nursing? And when you started down the nursing path, how did you find the hospice piece?
Well, yeah. So at the time I made the decision to go to nursing school, I had been a stay-at-home homeschooling mom for about 9 years. And my ex-husband and I decided to get divorced, and I needed a career. We both knew I needed a career if I was going to be a single mom. He wouldn't be able to support two households. So I had been a vet tech in the past, and I thought, well, medical field is probably good. And I looked in the newspaper and there were a lot of nursing jobs available. So I decided that would be for me. And also, side note, I was 40 when I went to nursing school. So I'm an old nurse. And I like to tell people that, because people will often say, oh, I've thought about being a nurse, but I'm too old. And I'm like, no, you're not. You're never too old to go back to school,
Good for
because
you,
I did it when
friend.
I
That's
was
so
40.
inspiring. Keep
Thanks.
going. Tell
So,
us more. I love the story.
So my ex-husband's stepmother had died of cancer a couple years prior to us making the decision to get divorced, and she was on hospice. And I just knew that I wanted to do, some kind of service work, and I was really impressed with those hospice nurses. So that was kind of my end goal, was to do that. And I was really lucky. I ended up working in a medical clinic, a family practice clinic, for 1 year. And then I went into a hospital and I worked in a med surge floor for 3 months. And then I was laid off. At that time, I was a licensed practical nurse, and I didn't think licensed practical nurses could work in hospice. But there was a hospice care center in the neighborhood, brand new one. And I thought, well, I may as well check into it. And sure enough, they did hire LPNs at the hospice care center. And so that's where I got my foot in the door, and eventually, moved through education and became an RN and a BSN and got my certification, and just have stayed with hospice ever since.
Wow, that is fantastic and just incredible. Love the story. Love the just your words of, hey, you're never too old to become a nurse or really seek education in any format. So good for you, Fred. I mean, a shining example of just how to persevere and, make it out, make things happen for yourself. I I mean, that's all you right there. So well done. And then to think too of how you're supporting people now, very impressive. Now, tell me more. So you become involved in the hospice field. You earn your nursing degree, and I think what I find so unique as well, another unique piece about your story is the social media element. And I give you so much credit because we've got a Twitter for our podcast, and I'm like, whew, I can hardly handle that, you know? So tell us about your social media platform, how you got involved with it, and just how it took off. I mean, you've got a significant number of followers. Fill us in a little bit.
Well, like many people, I discovered TikTok during the shutdown for the pandemic. I was actually watching the news and I saw a story about a pediatrician, Dr. Nicole Baldwin, who was doing some TikToks about vaccinating children. And she actually started getting a lot of death threats. And so I was like, oh, that's interesting. I had never heard of TikTok actually at that point and decided I would download the app and check it out. And I got sucked in right away. I've always had a bit of performance in my background, sang with the rock band, did like local theater, community theater. And so I really enjoyed watching the TikToks and started actually trying to learn how to shuffle dance was the first thing I did. And then I started seeing these trends and I did a kind of some of the silly little trends. But then I started to notice that there were people that were talking about, different types of medical care, nursing, doctors. And I thought, well, that maybe I'll tell, a hospice story. And so I told a hospice story and it went viral. And I started getting a lot of followers and a lot of comments and questions about hospice. And I quickly realized that people want to know about hospice. They want to know about it. They want to know about death and dying. I learned that there are a lot of people who have death anxiety. And I had death anxiety when I was in my 30s. It was very severe. And it was something that was resolved for me by being a hospice nurse. And it just grew from there. It just mushroomed.
Yeah, that is fantastic. What a cool thing you're bringing to the TikTok community and social media. And I have to agree with you. I feel like I don't know if it's certainly in America, but we kind of have that hesitancy of discussing the topic of death and dying. And I have found throughout our experience with this podcast that it certainly has helped shape my relationship with death and in a positive way, in that I feel much more comfortable talking about the subject, thinking about it, and anticipating my own inevitable death. I wanted to ask you, do you feel that that is a problem in our country and that people do have a difficult time with the topic of death and dying? And
Well,
with that, how are, I guess, tell us, maybe give us like an example of one of your videos and how you would maybe help share an experience with someone or help answer a question that they might have about the topic of death and dying.
sure. So I actually used to think it was just a problem in our country. We avoid the topic of death and dying, um, partially because medicine has advanced so far that people think that they can live forever. And it's a shock when they find out they can't. But I've learned through my social media that it's also prevalent in other countries where people are afraid of death and dying and don't want to talk about it. It's not just in the US. Um, and I've learned that when people avoid the topic, that creates death anxiety. Because it becomes unknown. Anything that's unknown is always going to be scary, and so people feel more fear around death and dying because it's such a taboo topic. Like, don't talk about it. You know, um, don't don't talk about death, and it's taboo and it's scary. As far as an example of a video, the video I always love to give an example of is, and why I kind of realize that my social media platform is different. There are a lot of other hospice nurses on social media. Not a lot. There's a few more hospice nurses on social media. Mine is really different. I do straightforward story time. I do Q&A all the time with comments, but I also do a lot of trending videos. I do like dancing with words about death and dying in hospice, and I do dark humor. It's not for everybody, but I've learned that a lot of people really like getting their education about death and dying in small little 15-second increments and in a lighthearted manner. That has really worked for me. So one of the videos that I did was a song that just goes, "It's just water, it's just water." And that's all it says. It's like 9 seconds long. It's just water. And I'm just dancing around to this video, and I'm lip syncing it, and I'm pointing to words that say, uh, your person, your dying person doesn't need fluids anymore. Their body is shutting down. They're going to die from dehydration, not from their disease. So I'm dancing around to this song, "It's Just Water," and pointing to the words, your person didn't die from dehydration. They died from their disease. And somebody left, and it went viral, big time viral. And somebody left me a comment that said, "Thank you so much. For 15 years, I have worried that my dad died of dehydration. And you just helped me to understand that he didn't." And I was like, wow, that was a 9 second video trend, little dance trend, lip sync thing. And it impacted this person. And I get comments like that all the time on those videos where, it's just a silly little thing. And somebody will say, "Oh, how much this helped me today." So
Yeah, how empowering, and shows your scope and your reach and ability to positively impact people through this media. So certainly something to be proud of, and again, a valuable tool and resource for all those listening. Tell us one more time your TikTok handle
it's
or
Hospice Nurse Penny.
Hospice Nurse Penny. Got it.
Yeah, I'm on TikTok and Instagram at Hospice Nurse Penny.
Okay, excellent.
I like
We'll make
Instagram
sure
better.
too to have
Instagram's
that
kind of more
info
fun.
up when we get this all up online for you. Very cool. So let me ask you next a little bit about the topic of medical aid in dying, as this is kind of, I guess, one of the big discussions for this podcast. I wanted to ask you if one, how you learned about medical aid in dying, and I guess what your initial thoughts were with something like that, especially someone being with a hospice background.
So I first learned about it. I had been a hospice nurse for probably about 2 years, 2 or 3 years. And it came up on the ballot in Washington State where I live. And I immediately knew that I was going to vote for it. I knew from being a hospice nurse that people can have the kinds of suffering that we really can't help. The way that we usually help with those types of suffering, existential suffering, which causes terminal agitation most often, or pain that we just cannot manage, is by doing something we call palliative sedation, where we literally sedate a person until their death. And to me, that is not a whole lot different than actually, medical aid in dying, because their life is stopping. Even though they're still alive and they're living, they're not really living. They're just alive on an infusion of medications until finally nature takes its course and they die. So it was kind of a no-brainer for me, that it should be legal. And I think it should be federally legal, and I think it should be accessible to more people. It's unfortunately not accessible to everybody who's terminally ill. People who have dementia, for example, are not able to utilize medical aid in dying because you have to be terminal with a life expectancy of 6 months or less, and you have to be determined to be able to make decisions. And when a person has dementia, by the time they're 6 months from death, they can no longer make decisions for themselves. So I think it's really unfortunate. I think that they should be allowed to make that decision when they get the diagnosis of dementia, and that hopefully if they have family members that are willing to help them with administration of the medication, then they could do that.
Yes, I agree. I've had two grandparents who have passed away from dementia, and it's just a horrible disease. I mean, it's yeah, we don't need to go into all the details, but the people are generally just a shell of themselves by the time they reach the end. And it for both of my grandparents that had it, it was just inevitable suffering,
Mhm.
towards the end. Tell us, have you worked with patients or families that have utilized medical aid in dying and, while you were there to support them?
I had one patient who had liver cancer, and he was in the process. And here's the problem: lots of times people, they get their terminal diagnosis too late, and the waiting time is too long. And so he was in the process of trying to get the approval from, you have to have two different physicians that will determine that you're decisional. He was in the process of doing that, and then he became very, very confused as a result of his disease process, very agitated, very confused, and was not able to seek that as an alternative to hospice. And his husband was so beside himself every time I went there to see him, and it was a lot of symptom management that we had to do. We ended up putting him in a hospice care center, and we ended up doing palliative sedation in the end. We could not control his agitation. Every time I went to see him, his husband would say this is exactly why he wanted to do medical aid in dying. He did not want to have to be going through this undignified end of life. He wanted to end this in his own way, on his own time. And he was so um, upset, that this is what ended up happening. But that's the only patient that I personally ever had that wanted to seek medical aid in dying. We've had more and more on hospice over the years. It seems it's become more accessible. The price of the medications have come down now in Washington. They went up for a while. I think they were $3,000, and a group of physicians got together and said, "Oh, well, we'll just use different medications." And so they came up with a different cocktail that costs less money. And so I think it's more accessible. So I know of more situations from my interaction with, the nurses who I work with. Um, and typically, when a person does medical aid in dying, hospice stays on board with them. And each agency is going to have their own policy as far as whether they'll let the hospice clinicians be present at the time that they take their medication. It's going to vary by agency. But we will not discharge, no hospice will discharge a patient who wants to do medical aid in dying. They are allowed to have that autonomy if it's legal in their state. And we support them as far as just being available for symptom management needs, to pronounce death if it's required in the state, to support the family after the death of the patient. So we're still present and involved with that person even when they do it.
Absolutely. Do you have colleagues, or have you been in a situation maybe with a family member or other professionals who maybe don't agree with the idea of medical aid in dying? And if so, what do you think the reason is generally? I suppose, and I am sure it varies from person to person, but do you think there's an overarching reason why this has become so difficult to pass these types of laws for people who are sick?
I don't personally know of any. Like I said, in my situation with the patient I had, his husband was totally on board with it. I haven't heard of any, through any of the complex case reviews I've been involved with, which is what we usually do when someone's doing medical aid in dying. I haven't heard of any situations where there are family members who are opposed to it. But I'm not surprised if that does come up for people, because there are people who are opposed to their person going on hospice. There are people who are opposed to their person with cancer stopping treatment. There's always going to be people who cannot face mortality, whether it's their own or the mortality of their person. And so they are just always, going to push back. I actually was invited by Compassion and Choices to testify at the Washington State hearing that we recently had for changing our law so that the waiting period could be shorter. And I did not get to testify. They ran out of time, so I had to submit my written testimony. But it was very interesting. I got to hear both sides of it. I heard from the medical side, who said, people should have the autonomy to do this if they want to, and the waiting period should be shorter so that they're able to complete this. And then I heard from the other side, and it was not a doctor, a lawyer who's disabled, who felt that, and this is what I think a lot of the time the problem is, he felt that this could end up being a situation where people would regard somebody who's disabled as not being worth as much as somebody who's not, and they might choose to, like, people are afraid that this is going to turn into euthanasia. That's what the overarching issue is. They're concerned that people are just going to start putting grandma and grandpa to sleep when they're tired of them. They don't understand that this is about choice for each individual person who wants to do this. There are these fail safes in place. There are these stopgaps that are like, you have to be determined to be decisional, and you have to be determined to have been the one to make the decision. It's not like somebody's just going to start going out there and, poking a needle in grandpa's arm and putting him to sleep. But there are people that are really afraid of that. They're just concerned that it's going to evolve into something more than what it is.
Yeah, it can be disheartening, certainly hearing some of the, I guess, opposition views and perspectives. And certainly we all have a different perspective, but I guess for me, a lot of this just comes down to self-determination and basic human autonomy and end of life care, really. I mean, very rarely do people get involved with, we don't get involved in each other's medical decision making choices, and feel like this is such an important piece at the end of someone's life, if not the most important choice that they're making. And it's really a bummer to think of how so many try to, you know, I guess, squash that, especially with the inevitability of what someone with a terminal disease is facing, which is death. And then the suffering that comes along with it can be pretty horrendous, firsthand, much more than I do. I mean, you've seen it. You've helped the people in that situation. What would you tell people who maybe have death anxiety? And in fact, I'd like to share. I remember I had a close friend growing up, and in our, I guess, college years, a couple times I'd breach the subject. Hey, what do you think's going to happen when we die? Like, it's the ultimate question, right? And I remember this person, she would get really anxious, and she'd just say, I can't talk about it. I don't want to talk about it. It makes me really nervous to think about. And I'm not going to sit there hammering questions at her. So we'll move on, her and I. But I just remember thinking how interesting that was to me. I guess for myself, these are questions I was always asking. Even I remember being a child looking up the stars and wondering, like, what's out there and what does happen when we die, right? So with that, obviously, as you mentioned, it's an uncomfortable and it's unknown, so therefore there is going to be some anxiety and baggage with it. But what would you suggest to people who might still not be as comfortable or ready to face death or talk about it? How they can
Well,
navigate there?
first of all, death anxiety is really normal and it's common. It's normal and it's common. So I think it's always good to know that you're not alone when you have those fears. What I've learned about death anxiety is that, and death and dying, is that people who are able to accept their death have a better death in the end. They're more likely to have a good death than those who are really fearful of dying. So getting to a place of acceptance is really important. And I always say, you don't have to like it, but you have to accept it because it's inevitable. We are all going to die. There's nobody that's ever not, nobody that's ever escaped dying. You're going to die. So accepting it's really great. to help with the death anxiety. And one of the ways that I like to recommend that people get to that place of acceptance is to just start thinking about legacy work, like what you want to leave behind, like whether it's going through pictures and just thinking to yourself, someday if I'm not here anymore, I don't want people to see that photo of me because it's a bad picture. Or working on advanced directives. One of the tools I love to use is called 5 Wishes. And it's a pamphlet. It's like $6. You can get it at fivewishes.org. And it's got questions in there that are really easy to answer, as far as what kind of care you would want if you were dying, how you would want to be cared for, what kind of music do you want to hear, how do you want people to be with you? Do you want them to be cheerful, or do you want them to be solemn? Do you want prayer at your bedside, or do you want to listen to rock and roll music? Like that type of thing, to kind of get your head around your plan for yourself. I think that is helpful in getting to a place of acceptance, because you could go on with the whole what happens after we die. And for me, that was part of my death anxiety, was this fear of there's not going to be anything. And that's a bigger question that's harder to answer, and you have to find that within yourself. For me, seeing dying people visioning at the end of life helped to alleviate that worry, because I do see people who vision their deceased loved ones and pets at the end of life. It's very
Tell us a little
common.
bit about that, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So,
'Cause yeah, I haven't heard much about this, and that's so fascinating.
yeah, it's actually so common that it's written into our hospice literature. It's a sign that a person is getting closer to the end of their life. It's one of those things where we go, I mean, we often will ask our patients about it. Have you been seeing any deceased loved ones or pets? Because it's a signal that they're getting closer to the end of life. It's very common. It can happen weeks before a person's death. Um, and it can be people that they knew, or pets. I had a lady start telling me there was a cat in her room, and finally remembered that it was a cat that had died when she was a kid. Sometimes people are not verbalizing to you what they can see. They're beyond the ability to speak to you, but they're reaching in the air like this, or they're looking up, or they're looking in the corner of the room. And so I kind of associate that with visioning, because usually when people are having deathbed visions, they're seeing them up in the air. Sometimes they're out in front, but mostly it's up in the air or in the corner of the room. It's quite vivid. If you see somebody having a deathbed vision, it's you couldn't argue with them that person isn't there, because they're so convinced that they're there. They're like, yeah, my wife is right there in the corner of the room. I see her right there, clear as day. She's right there. And you start to feel like, maybe I'm the one who's crazy because I can't see who they see. Um, but it's really common. And so for me, that was a part of getting over my death anxiety, having kind of this, okay, maybe there really is something after we die.
Yeah.
But then further, as I got on TikTok and realized, you know, you don't need to even develop um, that kind of awareness or belief to get over death anxiety. It could be a matter of just being comfortable with death, being comfortable with hearing about it, talking about it, learning about it. I have lots of people who follow me on the socials who are atheists. They do not believe in an afterlife. And they say that their death anxiety is resolved just through watching my videos and getting comfortable with learning more about death.
Very cool. Very interesting. The visions piece. Do you think? Well, since this question's stuck in my head, I'll ask it. The body. Do you think the body knows when it's time and just knows, like, okay, I'm ready. It's time to shut it down and die? And if so, how is that process? I mean, when you're with patients and maybe you're with them when they actually take their last breath, or maybe not, but do you think it's generally a comfortable process for these people, especially as you provide the hospice services?
Yeah. So, and I've been with lots of people as they took their last breath working in an inpatient care center. I've witnessed a lot of death, actual death. It is a process for the most part. Once in a while, you have people who die really suddenly, but when a person is dying a natural death from a disease, it's usually a process that they go through of the body is shutting down. There are different signs and symptoms that we see as the body shuts down. The arms and legs will sometimes get cool as the blood is all going to the core to get the heart and lungs oxygenated. Digestion shuts down. Digestion is an energy consuming process. So the body is trying to do this energy conservation. I always say the body is still trying to live while it's dying. It's trying to go through this shutdown process. And so there are things that happen in the person's body when they're going through this dying process. So I do think also the other side of that. So the body intuitively knows how to die. Dying is not uncomfortable in and of itself. The process of death is not necessarily uncomfortable, but diseases can cause discomfort. You know, you can have shortness of breath or pain or nausea and vomiting, but there are some deaths that never require any medication. Dementia is one. They might have aches and pains from, being fetal in position in their bed for so long, but typically people who have dementia don't necessarily need to be medicated at the end of life. So death itself, dying, is not necessarily uncomfortable. It's the diseases that can cause that discomfort. So the body intuitively can shut down. It knows how. People don't want to eat. They don't want to drink. Their breathing changes. Things are changing all over the place. And then also the other side of that is mentally what's going on. And people don't like to talk about the fact that their person is dying in front of their dying person because they're not, they don't want to give up. They don't want them to give up hope, or they don't want to be sad about it. So they choose to oftentimes avoid the topic of of death and dying with the dying person. And really, people know that they're dying. I mean, if you think about any time that you've ever been sick, you know when you're sick. Like, we live in our bodies, so we know that there's something happening. So even though people don't necessarily want to talk about it, doesn't mean that they aren't aware that their body is going through the dying process.
Yeah, that's lot of wonderful information there and perspectives to consider. And I'm thinking of my grandpa who passed away back in February, and he received hospice services for the last about 7 days of his life. And my mom will never. I wasn't able to go back home during this time, and he had requested. He didn't really want a lot of people coming in, and I wanted to respect that for him as well. But yeah, some of the things that the team was telling her to do, like trying to talk to him and play music for him and put on favorite songs and just sit with him and be there. But one thing that I found interesting as well was give him time alone. They had told her, give him a few hours every day where he can be by himself, because some people do want to pass and die on their own. And whether or not they're conscious, they might, be waiting for that moment. And I was going to ask, have you had any, I guess, peculiar experiences with that piece, supporting people and kind of tying into it? Have you ever been involved with animals and have animals around a person during the dying process and notice any, I don't know, I guess, changes in the animal behavior, or if they notice even? So just anything like that that you could share with us would be great.
Yeah. So as far as animals go, I had, and let me just, I can tell you a story that's going to tie all of that together, actually. People do often wait for someone to arrive or someone to leave before they die. We see that a lot. It's really as if they have control over their time of death. I've seen that so many times. Um, my patient was a man, and I was a home hospice nurse at the time. And his wife and then his two daughters from a previous marriage, adult daughters, were there. And I walked into the room and I said, "Oh my gosh, he really looks close. Like, I think he's probably minutes away from death." And each one of the ladies went and grabbed a body part, a hand or a foot. It's okay, Dad. It's okay. They were stroking his hand, stroking his foot. It's okay, Dad. It's okay. We're here, Dad. It's okay. And I said, and there was a dog under the bed. And that dog had not left underneath that bed, had been there like for all day since the morning. And this was the afternoon. And the dog had not even gone out to pee. And I said to the ladies, I'm going to go into the kitchen and do some charting, and you come and get me when you need me, meaning when he dies. So I went into the kitchen and I was in there charting, and I was there for probably 20 or 30 minutes. And I'm thinking, wow, I can't believe he's not already gone, because he really looked like he was minutes from death. And I walked back in the room, and all of them were still in there, and they were all still stroking his hand or his foot and saying, it's okay, we're here. And I said, is he the kind of guy that would have wanted you doting over him? And that one of the daughters looked at me, and she dropped his hand and she said, I've got to go to the bathroom. And she turned around and made a beeline for the door. And the other two ladies, same thing. They dropped his body part and they were like, me too, me too. And they all left the room. And then I was there with him and his dog under the bed. Dog was still under the bed. And so I followed them out of the room, walked into the kitchen, and I said, you know what? Sometimes we can keep people here without meaning to, by doing something that is, not what they would want us to be doing. And I mean, the conversation I had with them was maybe 2 minutes long. And I went back in to check on him, and he had died during that time. So he was like waiting. He wanted his dog there. The dog had been there all day, and he wanted that dog there, but he was not about to have those ladies see him die. He wanted them to be gone from the room.
It's heavy, heavy stuff. Um, wow, very, very, yeah, very. I mean, heavy and empowering. I think graceful in a sense, and empowering in the sense that it almost seems like there's part of him that knew, right? That was the subconscious or whatever, but part of him knew kind of what was going on, I guess. And I just think that's really fascinating. Similar thing, my mom had told us, I had an uncle who died of a brain cancer many years ago, but we were coming back from England. We had been living there at the time, and she still swears to this day that he like waited for us to come in because we went and saw him, and he died like I think it was the very next day when after we kind of got into town. Tell me a little bit more if you don't mind, because I'm thinking of Pam the cat now. But any other instances with animals where you noticed, behaviors or anything odd, I guess, during the dying process for somebody?
No, not that I can think. That the
Or
dog
did,
thing is always one that sticks with me. I can't really think of any others. Oh, I've heard of lots of stories where somebody had a cat in a nursing home that would go around and lay on a bed, and then the person would die. And then, each night the cat would lay on their bed and the person would die.
wow.
Um, but personally, I can't think of any, working in people's homes. You're not always there at the time when they're dying in a person's home. Um, but in the care center, we would allow pets to come in, but they wouldn't really stay the whole time necessarily. Um, Although, and this is kind of a really weird kind of woo woo story, but we did have a guy at the care center who had liver cancer and or cirrhosis of the liver, some liver disease. So he had a lot of confusion, and then he got to the point where he was unresponsive, and he had a little yappy dog that was always on the bed with him. And down the hall we had a lady who had ALS, and she had decided to do VSED, which is voluntary stop eating and drinking. And she had always wanted she knew at the care center that we did an honor toast after people died with sparkling non-alcoholic,
Grape juice
apple
or
juice.
whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. And so she knew about that because she'd been with us for months. And so she decided that she wanted to do that toast. She wasn't going to drink, but she called the staff in, and she said it was evening shift. I want you to do the honor toast. I feel like it's time. Um, and so they did, and they each went around and said something about her. And after the last person spoke, she died, which is that in of itself is really unusual for someone to be like, okay, I'm checking out now, and then die. But then what happened was across the hall, adjacent and down a little ways, was this guy with this yappy dog on the bed, and the dog all of a sudden starts yapping. This is per the family's report. Right around the time that this lady dies, this dog starts yapping, and it's the door is open and there's nobody there, and the dog is yapping at the door, and this man who had been unresponsive sits up in the bed and looks over to the door and says, "Who are you?" And then he says, "Oh, okay," and he lays back down, and there was nobody there at the door. And so story was, that this lady died down the hall and her spirit was leaving the building, and he saw her going. The dog alerted him, woke him up. He saw her, and she went on her way.
Wow. Yeah, that's I can imagine there's some unique stories like that in those situations and in those types of centers as well. One last question I had, I guess that is related to this topic is the idea of sudden loss versus like somebody who is receiving hospice care or maybe dies from like a long stage terminal disease or whatever it might be. I guess, do you think that there is a difference between something like a sudden loss, maybe car accident, heart attack, whatever, versus, a person who I guess has more time to kind of plan and look at their death from a different lens with more time, I suppose?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's never a good time to die, and there's never a good time to lose somebody that you love. So it's the question of is it which is easier is never you really can't answer, because it's not good to lose somebody that you love. But really, a sudden death is easier on the person who's dying. A planned death is easier for the family of the person who's dying. Because if you die suddenly, you don't know what you're even missing. But if you have a terminal diagnosis, you are able to go do what you want to do for the last part of your life. You can plan for things. You can tell your family what you want done with your body if that matters to you, or you can give away the things that are important to you, or tell people, what the meaning is behind things that you have. So that part of it is probably better, but you do have the burden of knowing that you're dying too. So that's another part of it. But I think one of the things about going on hospice, getting that terminal diagnosis and going on hospice, is that a lot of times, people get that terminal diagnosis, they're ready for hospice, they have this finite amount of time left. And at first it's really sad, it's shocking, and they grieve their impending death. But also it's freeing in a way for people to kind of now, especially if you've been sick and you've been dealing with lots of treatment, you get to this place where you're like, oh, okay, well, that's done. I don't have to do that anymore. I don't have to wonder if the treatment's going to work anymore. I don't have to experience the side effects of the treatment. I don't have to waste my time going to the doctor, so that's kind of freeing in that way. But I think sudden death for the person is easier, but for the family, it's probably harder. Um, I think there's a lot of people have probably a lot of issues with closure when somebody dies really quickly and they weren't expected to die. I think that's probably really hard for people because they never got to say goodbye.
Yeah, beautifully said. I think that's a perfect way of putting it. Um, Definitely kind of, I guess, in a way, pros and cons for each. What is anything? I want to give you the floor too, or anything that you want our listeners to know, or any advice, or you know, anything you'd like to share as we kind of wrap up our discussion. The floor is yours, obviously, and I feel like this conversation is just a wealth of good information and great stories too. But fill us in if you got anything else. We'd love to hear from you.
Well, I always, I am an advocate for hospice, and it's sooner is better than later. Gosh, if somebody has a terminal diagnosis or even a diagnosis that could potentially lead to terminality at some point, they might be undergoing cancer treatment that may or may not work. Sooner is better than later. People think that hospice is really meant for the final days of life, and it's not. Again, it's for a life expectancy of 6 months or less. We don't kick people off after 6 months. We have a recertification process, and as long as people continue to appear to have 6 months or less, and that's clinically supported, people can be on hospice for a year, 2 years, 5 years sometimes. That's not ideal, and we try to avoid that, but it happens. Death is really unpredictable, but hospice has a lot to offer. We have a lot to offer, and the more comfortable that a person can be with their own death, and that a family can be with the death of their person, the better experience it's going to be. There's a lot of services that we can provide. There's a lot of education that we can provide. I use the hashtag normalize death, because death is normal. And the more that you understand about it, the less scary it is, and the more supportive you can be for the person who's dying, the better conversations and end of life closure you can have with that person. There's just so many ways that we can really help somebody who's dying and their family to go through that process, to not have to be alone, and to understand what's happening and to not be afraid of it.
Excellent. Beautifully said. Thanks, Nurse Penny. This has been tremendous. Can't wait to share this episode with our listeners. One thing that I think has been a trend since we started this podcast piece or experience is it seems like we certainly learn something new every time we have a new guest. And it also seems like every episode is just getting better and better. So you are continuing to make things great for us and the listeners, and the services you provide to people are just incredible. So keep it going. And I love your story. Love how you got to where you are and that you kept persevering, went to nursing school at 40, and you're making such a massive difference. So thank you.
Thanks for having me on.